So it's time for, let's take the next step in our kingdom teaching series, shall we? We're walking through the Gospel of Luke. We're looking for unique kingdom references, kingdom of God references that we haven't seen yet in Matthew or Mark, but are unique to Luke. And there's a section here in Luke that's always been, I don't know, is it one of my favorite sections of Luke? I think so. And, but there's going to be, it's a short little passage. It may not be a long video today, but it's going to be packed full of what for me is convicting, just kind of like kingdom of God gut punches. Like, do I really want to be a part of the kingdom of God? Like, we're looking at this whole teaching series trying to figure out what is the kingdom of God? What's it like? What's my relationship to it? What is God inviting me into? And these few references here are, man, they really expose some of my own idolatry. So this lesson today, this conversation, is not going to come from a heavy-handed, pointed at you guys, watchers, viewers, listeners. Like, no. This conversation today is pointed directly at me, and I would assume maybe many others of you. But I'm going to be concerned enough with myself today. As we look at this. But the reference today comes at the end of Luke 9. We got into Luke 9 in the last video, and at the end of Luke 9, at the very end of chapter 9 of Luke, we have our next reference to the kingdom of God, and it shows up in a passage that a lot of Bibles will have a subtitle that says, "The Cost of Following Jesus." So let's take a look at what's said here about the kingdom of God. As they were walking along the road, a man said to him, speaking of Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Okay? So somebody comes up and says, essentially, I want to be your disciple. And Jesus' response is, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head," which I assume, by the way, is some kind of a remez. I assume that Jesus is referring back to different Old Testament passages, at least one, if not two or more, passages that would illuminate that. But I just want to kind of stay here on the surface. We're not told what the person says. I think this passage kind of assumes a negative response, that whoever came said, "I want to follow you," and Jesus said this, and their response was like, they didn't, or this is essentially Jesus turning them down. I find it interesting, by the way, side note, P.S. I find it interesting that whenever Jesus is asked, people say, "I want to be your disciple," Jesus' response is always no. The demoniac begs to come with Jesus. Jesus says, "I need you to stay here." 3 people in today's passage are going to come and say, "Let me follow you." Jesus is going to turn them down. And yet Jesus went and called people who weren't necessarily even expecting to be called by Jesus to be his disciple. I find it so weird. Jesus' methodology is so backwards from the world and the ministry that I typically am involved in. And I don't know what there is to learn from that. But I digress. Somebody comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, I want to follow you." Jesus essentially says, "No, you don't. Because foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." So what's kind of like my Peshat level takeaway from this teaching? I would say one of the things that I could learn from this. What is the kingdom like? We haven't even gotten to the kingdom reference, but let's assume that Jesus is talking about the kingdom. I think that's going to be clear here in just a moment. If Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God is no respecter of my comfort. Like, I talk a good game. I talk about how I want to be a part of the kingdom of God. I know about the kingdom of God. Let's talk about the Jewish context and the euangelion, and let's proclaim that a new king and a new kingdom is here. And Jesus is like, hey, let's get one thing straight. The kingdom of God is not here to give you all your comfortable amenities. And let's not even talk about amenities. Like, it's talking about like basic housing. Like, the kingdom of God is not interested in making sure that you are sheltered and fed. You may go hungry. You may go homeless. And Jesus sees this would-be disciple and realizes that he wants to be a disciple, but he at least wants to be guaranteed, at least as the story is told. I think it assumes that there are some of us we want the kingdom of God, we want to follow Jesus, but we want to make sure there's a guarantee of some, at least a baseline. And Jesus says, no, you're not guaranteed that. The kingdom of God does not guarantee you a baseline of food and clothing and shelter. I think most of us assume it does. If Jesus were to come to me and say, there's a new king and there's a new kingdom. The kingdom of God is here. By the way, I'm not sure you have anywhere to sleep, and I'm not sure when your next meal is going to come. You're going to have to give all that up. You still interested? Golly, I'm not sure I say yes, if I'm honest. In a theoretical world, I'm like, oh yes, I'll follow you anywhere. But when I truly know myself, and some of you would say yes far quicker than I would. So that's just for me, but man. And again, I'm not saying that any of those amenities mean you're not in the kingdom of God. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm not saying that if you do have comfort, God desires you to be uncomfortable. You have to get rid of your comfort. No. God gives us lots of things. God gives lots of us blessings and comfort and wealth, and then asks us to steward those things well. But the kingdom of God does not guarantee it. So I am not saying that if you have it, you're in a bad place or the wrong place, or you need to move from that place. Not at all. Not at all. I'm filming this right now in my wonderful office in a wonderful house with way more than I deserve in my life. I have no plans to pull my kids out of school, sell my house, move away from my comfort. I think Jesus wants me to. But there's a lesson here. There's a lesson here in this story. There's a lesson here. It's not demanding that I change everything, but it is asking me to ask myself, if I lost all this tomorrow, if I lost it all tomorrow, would I still follow Jesus? Would I still be interested in the kingdom of God? Because the kingdom of God does not guarantee me this stuff. Man. Next. He said to another man, follow me. So this time, Jesus says, the first one came to him. Jesus, I want to follow you. This time, Jesus says to somebody else, follow me. Somebody else just got an opportunity to follow Jesus. But he replied, Lord, first let me go bury my father. Jesus said to him, let the dead bury their own dead, but you must go and, here's this phrase from our last video, proclaim the kingdom of God. Now, this is a tricky one, because it sounds like Jesus has this really cold, hard-hearted approach. Here's this guy who we assume has this aging father who's on his deathbed, and all he wants to do is be there for his dad as he dies. And Jesus is like, nope, let the dead bury their own dead. You got to come on my mission trip. And it just kind of seems like there's this weird dissonance there. But what's probably the case here in historical context, when he says, let me bury my father, here's probably where he's at. His dad has probably already passed away, and he is living in a 1-year period of time in between the passing of a relative and the 1-year anniversary of that passing. So when somebody in your family dies, they take the body and they put it in a tomb, and they cover it in spices that are not designed to preserve the body. They are designed to speed up decomposition. Did you hear that? It's the opposite of our world. They do not embalm the body. They wrap it in spices that will speed up the decomposition. The reason why is because on the 1-year anniversary of their death, you're going to go into the tomb, and the whole family's going to be there, and you're going to there's going to be a skeleton there, with some tendons and some ligaments, and you're going to cut those tendons and ligaments. You're going to gather up the bones. You're going to put the bones in a box called an ossuary, and then you're going to put that ossuary in your family's cabinet. You have like a niche in the larger extended family's tomb where your family is buried in that niche, right? So that's the process. The Jews had this I don't want to call it a superstition, but that's probably what it is. It was a religious superstition. It's not in Torah. You're not told you have to do this in Torah. I'm not even sure how much you're told you have to do in Talmud. But there was a cultural belief, a superstition, that in doing this 1-year anniversary thing that God never commanded directly, you were essentially ushering them in to the world to come. If you didn't do this, you were not helping them. Who knows what God might do? But by doing this, you were aiding in their redemption. Take it or leave it, that's what they understood. What is likely being said here is Jesus says, come follow me. And this guy is like, my dad died 7 months ago. And I really want to make sure I'm around, because if I miss the whole, burying my dad in an ossuary and what if he doesn't make it to the age to come? This kind of like superstitious concern about navigating the afterlife. And Jesus says, that is not what good biblical theology is about. Biblical theology is about life before death, not life after death. Come be a part of the kingdom of God now. We need you to be a part of something now, not holding on to your religious superstitions about what happens later. Come be a part of what God's doing now. So, the first lesson was the kingdom of God is simply not interested in my comfort and my amenities. The second lesson is that the kingdom of God does not answer to my religious superstitions or my systematic theology. The kingdom of God is doing what God is doing in the world. God is going to do what he's doing in the world. God doesn't care about what theology you were handed in Bible college, but you got to do this, and this, and here's your theological explanations, and here's why and your theological proof texting and excuses, theological excuses. Kingdom of God's not interested in your theological excuses. Kingdom of God's now. And that's another zinger for me. The kingdom of God doesn't answer to my need for comfort, and the kingdom of God is not interested in my theological excuses. One more. Let's look at the last one. Still another said, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Jesus replied, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. Now, what is Jesus referencing? This person says, I want to come follow you. I just need to go tell mom and dad first, right? So let me go say goodbye to my family. And Jesus says something about putting a hand to the plow. This is a remez. If anybody remembers the story of what the Jews call the first rabbi-disciple relationship. The first rabbi-disciple relationship in Jewish tradition is understood to be Elijah and Elisha. Do you remember the story in the Old Testament? Elijah goes to Elisha and says, I want you to come follow me. I want you to be my disciple. And Elisha says, well, let me make sure I go home and say goodbye to my family. To which Elijah says, what have I done to you? Why do you treat me like this? And leaves. Essentially, Elijah, fire, chutzpah-laden Elijah, essentially he says, I'm offering you the chance of a lifetime. Come be a part of the thing that God's doing. And Elisha's response is essentially, well, just give me a sec. To which Elijah says, well, then forget it. So if you remember the story, Elisha takes the plow. He's literally plowing the field with 12 yoke of oxen when Elijah shows up. He's got 12 yoke of oxen. He's plowing. He's in the middle of work. He says, give me a second. Elijah freaks out. Elisha takes the oxen and the plows. He sets the plows on fire. He offers the oxen as a burnt offering. And essentially Elijah can see the burnt offering going up. And Elisha essentially wins him over by essentially saying, I'm sorry. I should have never, I'm ready. I'm ready to go. So this person wants to make the same exact mistake that Elisha was about ready to make. And Jesus says, no. No one who puts his hand to the plow, Elisha, is fit for the kingdom. You can't let the most pressing matters of your to-do list, the things that you've got to get done, they can't come before the kingdom of God, which may seem for some of you like a really trivial matter. Well, of course, duh. Like, who cares about that? I gotta tell you, I'm deeply convicted by that. I'm kind of an anxiety-ridden, like, control freak. Like, I really like to make sure that what I start, I can get done and finished. I can't tell you how many times I've probably missed the kingdom of God and what the kingdom of God is doing because I've got these other things that I insist have to be done first. These three stories kill me when it comes to the kingdom of God, because I think I fail all three of these tests on a regular basis. What can I learn about the kingdom of God? It does not guarantee your comfort or the basic needs for your survival. That's not what the kingdom of God is about, and it doesn't guarantee those things. What else can I learn from the kingdom of God? It is not a respecter of my theological excuses. All my justifications for why I'm really following you, Jesus. I'm telling you no, but here's why I'm really following you anyway. Nope. Kingdom of God won't work that way. You will not find yourself in the kingdom of God if that's the way you approach it. And the last and final thing we learned from the kingdom of God is it's not interested in letting you deal with what you consider to be the most pressing needs before you say yes. And that's convicting. Here's the beautiful news, because when I hear those three stories and I hear that passage, I start to wonder if I'm ever going to make it into the kingdom of God. Like, honestly, I walk away from this passage today going, man, I just fail all the time. I don't think I'll ever experience the kingdom of God. Here's the beautiful thing. I can look back on my life for the last 10 years, 15 years, and I can see how even though those things are still true about me, God in his faithfulness and his grace has taken what little surrender I've been able to give him. Whenever I can say yes to Jesus, he will take it and use it to transform me, little by little, bit by bit. And while all of these three things are true about me, they're a little less true than they used to be. And they're a little less true than they used to be. And they're a little less true than they used to be. And the reason for that is because the kingdom of God, whenever I've said yes to it, I don't say yes to it nearly as much as I ought to. But whenever I've said yes to it and walked through the gates for at least a moment, I've walked back out changed, made new, transformed. And I find unbelievable hope in that. So maybe that's an indirect observation about the kingdom of God. It's that the kingdom of God is relentless. It just keeps asking me and inviting me to say yes. And whenever I say yes, it changes me a little. Which means I can keep moving into the next video, into the next teaching, trying to look for the kingdom of God, because every time that I choose to say yes to it, I'll be a little bit more like Jesus. Until then, I'll look forward to the next time we chat. Talk to you in the next video.